commemorative address, and it'll be given to us by Major General Paul Irving, AM, PSM, RFD.
The Mayor of Gallipoli, Lady Cutler, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and importantly, girls and boys. At this time, 100 years ago, the Australian and New Zealand soldiers, or Anzacs, stormed ashore at Anzac Cove to be met by brave and resolute Turkish soldiers who were defending their country against the foreign invaders. As British war correspondent Ashmead Bartlett wrote of the landing, the Australians rose to the occasion. They did not wait for orders, but sprang into the sea, formed a sort of rough line, and rushed the Turkish trenches. The magazines were uncharged, so they went in with cold steel. The race of athletes scaled the cliffs, oblivious to the Turks firing down on them. On the wounded Anzacs who had been shot to bits, Ashmead Bartlett said, "The courage displayed by the wounded Australians will never be forgotten. They were happy because they knew they had been tried for the first time and had not been found wanting." It is fitting, therefore, at this unique memorial Anzac Dawn service, that we're joined by our Turkish brethren, not at war, but at peace. For both countries, the Anzac landing set off a train of events that will have significant implications for the then young and newly found nation-state of Australia, and later for the rise of the modern nation-state of Turkey. And both countries suffered grievously as a result of the 8 months of fighting on the rocky shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula. More than 8,000 Australians died here at Gallipoli, many of whom have no known grave. The Turks suffered even more grievously. They had more than 250,000 casualties, of whom almost 87,000 soldiers were killed in action. It is doubtful that any of those Anzacs who crouched in their transport vessels just before dawn 100 years ago here at Gallipoli would have any idea of the legend that became synonymous with the word Anzac. Out of their courage, endurance, and initiative in the face of overwhelming odds on the beaches and cliffs at Gallipoli, a legend was created. This legend was not about a great military victory, because Gallipoli was, by any measure, a tragic defeat. This legend was about sacrifice and gallantry against the odds, where the Anzacs fought well above their weight. It is also a legend of men unhesitatingly answering the call to arms at the request of their government. The first Australian Imperial Force consisted mostly of volunteers who downed their tools, walked off their farms and went to war. In fact, the first Australian Imperial Force was the only purely volunteer army that fought in the Great War. Australians were accustomed to teamwork, whether on the sporting field or in their industrial organisations, and the teamwork developed by the Anzacs was of the highest order of efficiency. We also had a unique sense of humour. My godfather was at Gallipoli. Most of the men in his boat were killed on landing. In 1965, on the 50th anniversary of the Anzac landings, my godfather wrote a book titled A Treasury of Anzac Humour. I would like to read a little of the introduction to his book. Nobody will deny that war is a grim business. However, no matter how grim things were, the Australian soldier always took time out for a laugh. That laugh could have been on the beach at Anzac, in the trenches of France, on the dusty deserts of Africa, along the jungle trails of New Guinea. in the fever-ridden swamps in the Dutch East Indies, in the hell camps of Asia and Germany, on the seven seas and high in the skies along the far-flung battle lines of the Allies. Yes, wherever you found an Australian soldier, there you found laughter and humour. It was a spontaneous kind of humour which had become world famous. Any ex-serviceman will tell you there were times when humour saved the day, when a laugh was as good as a battalion of reinforcements. On a national broadcast on the eve of Anzac Day in 1964, I was asked the question, what did Gallipoli mean to me in 1915? Gallipoli meant the happiest days of my life. That happiness was inspired by two things. First, the comradeship of men that I found there. Comradeship of men who would gladly give their lives for you. Secondly, the digger humour played a big part in my happiness. I am convinced that the spirit of Anzac was born of digger humour. I would say, with a full measure of sincerity, that I have seen more laughter and humour per square yard of Gallipoli than I have seen per 100 square miles of Australia. Let us look at the statistics when the Anzac legend was created. They are simply staggering. Out of a population of just under 5 million in Australia in 1915, 800,000 Australians volunteered for service in the First World War, roughly half of those eligible. 330,000 Australians served overseas, and 63,163 died on active service, or little less than 1 man in 5. Around 155,000 Australians suffered casualties. About 2/3 of all Australians who went overseas were casualties, the highest rate amongst the forces of the then British Empire. And what is often forgotten was the impact on families. Nearly every family in Australia had someone serving overseas or had friends serving. Often all these families received would be a telegram informing them that their son or husband or father or boyfriend had been killed or wounded. There were no grand military funerals with senior politicians and the military brass present, as we have experienced in recent years, when sadly our soldiers in Afghanistan have paid the supreme sacrifice. In many cases, the families did not know where their loved one had been buried because there was no known resting place or there was no recognisable body. Yet somehow these families were supposed to pick themselves up and get on with their lives. The impact on these families and on Australia continues to this day. There were no psychological services for soldiers who had endured the war. Many soldiers who returned home after the war, including some who had been awarded the highest bravery award, the Victoria Cross, simply could not cope after the horrors of war in the transition to civilian life and disappeared, self-harmed, or became alcoholics. 2,000 of those men who returned from the war were permanently hospitalised as a result of their war wounds. And in fact, 21 years after the war had ended, at the outbreak of World War II, there were nearly 50,000 veterans from World War I in hospital. Unlike the Australians, many of whom made the ultimate sacrifice for a cause of which they knew nothing, or saw the First World War as an adventure or an opportunity to see the world, the Turks were war-weary, as they had been fighting wars for centuries. The most famous Turkish song about the war at Gallipoli is called Çanakkale, a mournful account of boys about to go to war being mustered in the Anili Chasi, the marketplace for mirrors in Çanakkale. The lyrics of the song are, "The war came down on us like a fire. The whole country shed tears. At the Anili Chasi, the marketplace, I'm leaving for the enemy. Mother, and there goes my boyhood." This sentiment was reinforced in Turkey's most powerful poem about Gallipoli, where an old Turkish soldier, travelling on a train, tells his tale about his experiences at Gallipoli to a student. Medics put us on horse carts, one on top of another, like empty wheat bags. 10, 15 wounded on a cart. Some cry out, some die that minute. The roads of Ari Banu are bumpy. It is dark. I am lying on my back. Another body underneath wriggles. On my chest, a pair of legs, but half of one is missing. At the 6-hour truce on the 24th of May 1915, when the Anzacs and the Turks mingled, talked, swapped tobacco and buried each other's dead, a Turk turned to Captain Aubrey Herbert as they stood among the rotting bodies, and he said, "At this spectacle, even the most gentle must feel savage, and the most savage weep." Perhaps the very close proximity between the Australians and the Turkish trenches over the 8 months of the campaign gave to Gallipoli a human dimension that was almost entirely missing from the mass industrialised warfare on the Western Front or on the mobile operations in the Sinai. Like the Australians, Turkish families had to cope with missing loved ones who would never return, with nursing wounded soldiers and assisting those soldiers who had lived with the horrors of war on the Gallipoli Peninsula in integrating back into their former lives. Also, like us, the Turkish people value compassion, sacrifice and courage, and that these are universal human qualities treasured by friend and foe alike. Today we give homage to the spirit of Anzac, forged by the Anzac soldiers at Gallipoli and then hardened by those soldiers in the deserts of Sinai and Palestine and in the trenches on the Western Front in Belgium and in France. We also pay homage to the more than 102,000 Australians who have made the supreme sacrifice from the war in the Sudan in 1885 to current operations and who lie in numerous cemeteries or remembered on memorials throughout Australia and overseas. We also remember those servicemen and women who returned to Australia physically or psychologically damaged as a result of their war service, many with reduced life expectancy as a result of their wounds. And importantly, we pause today and reflect on the impact on families who lost loved ones or had to nurse soldiers after their return to Australia from war service, many of whom had suffered horrific wounds. The legend of Anzac is not about glorifying war. On the contrary, it is a story of ordinary Australians performing extraordinary deeds in the most atrocious conditions. It is a story of such sacrifice and bravery that we gained a deeper faith in our democratic systems and in ourselves. In short, we gained a much deeper understanding of what it means to be an Australian, lest we forget. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.